A second sabre blow hit Andrew Bobola in the foot. Following this blow, the saint fell to the ground. One of the executioners then gouged out his right eye with a knife. The martyrdom of St Andrew Bobola and the confession made during it, "My faith is true and leads to salvation," point to the one and true Church. The Cossacks who captured the Jesuit Andrew Bobola on the 16th of May, 1657, near Janów Poleski in present-day Belarus, demanded that he abandon his faith and convert to orthodoxy. When persuasion and threats failed, they stripped him of his clothes, tied him to a fence, and whipped him with whips. After he was untied, they continued to beat him across the face so that several of his teeth were knocked out. They then tied his hands, placed him between two horses, and set off for Janów, 4 kilometers away, where their unit was stationed. When Bobola's strength waned during the march, they rushed him with whips and lances. After such urging, 2 deep wounds remained on his body, as well as 1 cut, most likely from a sabre, on his left shoulder. In Janów, the Cossack elders received him with taunts and shouts. "It is this Pole, a priest of the Roman faith, who draws away from our faith and converts to his Polish faith." Andrzej Bobola was not frightened by the horror he faced, and when the leader of the Cossacks asked him if he was a priest, he answered that he was a Catholic priest, that he was born into that faith and wanted to die in it. He also boldly confessed, "My faith is true and leads to salvation, but you have to convert and do penance, because you will not save yourselves in your errors." This confession enraged the Cossack commander, who was most likely the son of an Orthodox clergyman. The Cossack drew his sabre and aimed a blow at Bobola's head, but the latter, as a result of a natural defensive reflex, dodged and covered up with his hand so that he thwarted the fatal cut. He was, however, wounded in 3 fingers of his right hand. This wound was later identified as a calf. A second blow hit him in the foot, cutting a vein and damaging the bone. Following this blow, Andrzej Bobola fell to the ground. One of the executioners then gouged out his right eye with a knife. The bloody spectacle prepared by the Cossacks attracted a large crowd of curious commoners. In fact, the whole incident was observed by ordinary onlookers from the very beginning. From the accounts of these witnesses, we know quite precisely the course of the martyrdom of Andrzej Bobola. It is difficult to establish precisely the exact order in which the tortures were inflicted, as the testimonies of the witnesses differed in this respect. However, they all took place. The injuries left traces on the body of the martyr. Since Andrzej Bobola's body had not decomposed after death, all the wounds from the torments could be confirmed during the inspection. As the Cossacks were very keen to persuade the well-known missionary to deviate from Catholicism, they decided to force him to convert to Orthodoxy with cruel torments. On the market square in Janów, there was a shed used as a slaughterhouse. Bobola was dragged there, dragged by his left leg, and thrown onto a butcher's table. The shed had many windows and crevices through which curious young men and boys watched the torture. The 4 Cossacks proceeded to abuse the mutilated Jesuit. First, they soaked young branches from an oak tree and wrapped them around the victim's head. They then pulled their ends so that they pressed into the flesh, right down to the bone, making sure, however, that the skull did not crack, and thus that the torment did not end too soon. Then, again demanding that he abandon the Catholic faith, they baked his body with fire. His determined refusal drove them to ever greater cruelty. "With these hands you celebrate Mass. We will make you better," the torturers cried out to him and drove splinters under his fingernails. "With these hands you turn over the pages of the books in the church. We will turn over your skin you dress in a chasuble. We will decorate you better. You have too small a tonsure on your head. We will cut a bigger one for you." They continued to call out in a criminal frenzy. They then cut the skin from his arms, chest and head with knives and sprinkled the fresh wounds with husks. They also cut off the index finger of his left hand, the tips of both first fingers, and cut the skin from his hands. They also cut off his nose and lips. Listening to the description of these atrocities on the one hand, it is hard to believe how a man could have endured such torture. He must somehow have been strengthened by God, who gave him superhuman moral and physical strength. And on the other hand, what kind of monster must one be to inflict such cruel suffering on anyone? During the torments he suffered, he invoked Jesus and Mary, as many witnesses testified. His patience and perseverance in enduring the torments further infuriated his persecutors. So they decided to deprive him of his tongue. They cut a hole in his neck and severed his tongue at the very base. In addition, they inserted a thick butcher's awl into his left side. Finally, they hung him from the ceiling by his legs, head down, and mocked his body, racked by convulsions and spasms. "Look how the pole dances!" they exclaimed. Severed from the rope, the body of Andrew Bobola fell to the ground in the middle of the butcher's shed, clothed in the purple chasuble of his own blood. A Cossack colonel who had just arrived in Janów, seeing that Bobola was still showing signs of life, ordered him to be put to death. 2 blows to his neck with a Cossack sabre ended the almost 2-hour-long torment, and the martyr's death occurred at around 3 p.m., it being the day before the Ascension of the Lord. Meanwhile, a detachment of the Polish army, led by Colonel Naruszewicz, began to approach Janów. Its task was to disperse the Cossack troops and clear the area of them. Upon hearing this, the Cossacks retreated from Janów in panic and haste. The martyred body of the martyr, covered with a shroud, was placed in the local church. On hearing of their confrere's death, Jesuits from Pinsk arrived in Janów. They dressed the martyr in a Jesuit cassock and took him with them. The appearance of the body after the Cossack torture presented such a horrifying appearance that neither the clerics nor the students of the college were allowed to see it. A cross and the Latin inscription Pater Andreas Bobola Societatis Iesu, which means Father Andrew Bobola of the Society of Jesus, were placed on his coffin. The funeral took place without any pomp. The coffin was carried into the church basement and placed next to the other deceased in the crypt, which was located under the great altar. The memory of the martyr and his sacrifice faded after some time. Causes of martyrdom. Listening to the description of the ordeal, the hatred of the Cossacks towards the Jesuits and the Catholic Church must be astonishing, but it begs the question why the Cossacks hated the Jesuits so much, who, after all, conducted their mission completely peacefully. With their words, zeal and dedication, they convinced the Orthodox to convert to Catholicism. All these conversions took place entirely voluntarily. However, the Jesuits were remarkably effective in their activities, which did not please everyone. St Andrew Bobola is a martyr for the unity of the Church. In order to know the reasons for his martyrdom and to understand how the situation in which this martyrdom was made possible came about, we must go back several centuries to the schism that arose when the Christian East split from the Church. The final rupture between East and West occurred in the year 1054, but this was only the sealing of a long process. The western part of the Roman Empire collapsed under the blows of the Germanic invaders. Those who remained in the East were heirs to the impressive civilizational achievements of ancient Rome. This led the Byzantines to pride. The proud Byzantines did not want to hear about the supremacy of some barbarian from the West. The schism grew gradually over the centuries at all levels of society in the Eastern Empire. Above this, the Byzantines contrived to believe that authority in the Church came not from the authority of its founder, but from the emperor. In their pride, the Byzantines considered the emperor as equal to the apostles. The Constantinopolitan emperor, in his official titulary, also held the title Is Apostolos, equal to the apostles. For this reason, the emperor considered himself the superior of the church, able to appoint bishops, decide on disciplinary and even doctrinal matters. These usurpations and practices were accepted with understanding and met with no resistance in Eastern Christianity. This is how Poland found itself in the West and Kiev Rus in the East. Except that the antagonism between Rome and Constantinople did not bother anyone there too much. Marriages continued to take place between the Piast dynasty ruling in Poland and the Rurikikovichs ruling in Rus. By the middle of the 12th century, papal legates were in Kiev, and representatives of the Kiev metropolis attended the councils of Lyon, Constance and Florence, which would indicate that Kiev Rus did not break unity with Rome. That is, the mutual excommunication of the Pope and the Patriarch was not taken too seriously in Kiev. Later efforts at union in the territories did not come from nowhere. In the mid-13th century, Ruthenia fell into Mongol bondage. Then the Lithuanians drove the Mongols out of Western Rus, and the areas inhabited by Christians subject to Constantinople found themselves within the borders of the state formed by the union of Poland and Lithuania. Rome did not cease in its efforts to bring the separated Christians back into unity. An opportunity to do so came when the Turks began to threaten Constantinople, and the Byzantine emperor sought help in the west. In 1439, an ecclesiastical union was concluded at the Council of Florence. It did not last long because in 1453 the Turks captured Constantinople, the last emperor died, and the Constantinople Patriarchate came under the rule of a Muslim sultan. In the Polish-Lithuanian state, the Florentine union lasted a little longer. However, the union in Ruthenia did not take deeper roots. King Sigismund the Old, as a result of an erroneous decision, handed over the Kiev metropolis to Jonah, an open, schismatic, overly inclined towards Moscow. The pull towards Moscow of the Orthodox metropolis of Kiev was dangerous to the sovereignty and unity of the Polish-Lithuanian state. Breaking the ties linking Orthodox Ruthenians with Moscow was also a raison d'être. The act of the Union of Brest was not a move of a purely state-oriented nature, caused by political calculations alone. Besides, a weak state power would not have been able to impose the union without a strong aspiration for unity with Rome on the part of the Orthodox themselves, and the state of orthodoxy in the territories of the Polish-Lithuanian state was downright disastrous. The authority of the Orthodox bishops was very much weakened. In fact, it was the local aristocracy that decided on appointments to Orthodox offices. The assumption of a bishopric theoretically had to be approved by the king himself, but from the 15th century onwards, de facto bishops were appointed by the aristocrats who actually ruled the bishopric. Often these were not celibate monks as required by Orthodox canons, but married clergy. There were even cases of lay people becoming them, who were given the office and the associated income as a reward for merit to the aristocrat who actually ruled the bishopric in question. Cases of buying offices were not uncommon. After all, a bishopric was associated with considerable income. It was no better in the monasteries. Igumens. The superior of the monasteries lived there not infrequently with their wives and children. Another manifestation of the serious crisis of orthodoxy was the low intellectual level of the clergy, which entailed great religious ignorance among the faithful. The clergy simply did not know the elementary truths of the faith and the moral principles they should preach and instill. The Orthodox clergy, for the most part, consisted of illiterates and was burdened with families. It carried out practically no pastoral work. Its activity was limited to Sunday liturgy and the celebration of weddings, baptisms, and funerals. Orthodox clergymen were not respected, rather they were despised. The nobility, including their co-religionists, treated them on a par with serfs. The son or son-in-law of a pop usually became a pop, inheriting the Orthodox Church from him and learning the basic liturgical acts from him. Historians calculate that in the Polish-Lithuanian state, annually, on average, nearly 100 noble families abandoned Orthodoxy and converted to Catholicism. Many did so because they had no one from whom to learn the truths of faith and morals, or even to receive the sacraments. The popes did not care about their faithful. They themselves lived without confession, and whoever wanted to confess would not receive absolution. It is difficult for us to understand this today, but many Orthodox clergy were so ignorant that they did not know the sacramental formula for absolution, so the faithful only recited the penitent's prayer. If there was a clergyman who knew how to administer this sacrament, he absolved only for money. Many of the more enlightened Orthodox bishops and monks, as well as laymen from the nobility and bourgeoisie, recognized these problems and were pained by the state of the Church. A movement of reform and renewal sprang up, started by Prince Konstantin Ostrogsky, governor of Kiev. He was a great wealthy man. He owned more than 1,000 villages and 35 towns. Prince Ostrogsky's importance in the Orthodox Church was greater than that of the Metropolitan of Kiev, and even that of the Patriarch of Constantinople himself, for he was the patron of 1,000 Orthodox churches and 2 Orthodox bishoprics. Unable to rely on the episcopate, Prince Ostrogsky took on the work of repair himself, which paradoxically led him later on to become the staunchest opponent of the Union, a work he had largely initiated. For even during the reign of King Stephen Batory, he was in contact with the papal nuncio, Posawina, on this matter, and was in correspondence with Rome itself regarding the possible union of all Orthodoxy with Catholics. He also discussed the matter personally with the famous Jesuit father Piotr Skarga. The merits of this Jesuit for convincing Eastern Christians of the union were immense. His famous work on the unity of the Church of God under one shepherd and the Greek departure from this unity, published in 1577, caused considerable spiritual ferment among the Orthodox. It is noteworthy that the first edition of this book was dedicated precisely to Prince Ostrogsky, who was, after all, still an Orthodox, and the dedication was accepted by the prince. It should be noted that Prince Ostrogsky conducted the talks on the union with a complete disregard for the bishops and other Orthodox clergy. This, and Ostrogsky's views close to Calvinism, caused the Orthodox bishops themselves to take the matter of union with Rome into their own hands, which may to some extent explain why Ostrogsky later became an enemy of the Union of Brest. Their efforts are evidenced by the synods of Orthodox bishops held each year. It is evident at these that there was full agreement on the need to conclude a union with the Pope. Only the terms of such an agreement were discussed. Talks with Rome were going on all the time. Just before the Act of the Union of Brest, a number of Orthodox bishops had conflicted with the Patriarch of Constantinople and had broken ties with him, so they were more inclined to submit to the supremacy of the Pope. The cause of these conflicts, apart from the huge sums he demanded for episcopal appointments, was the Orthodox brotherhoods. Orthodox church confraternities were previously unknown in Orthodoxy. They originated and developed in the Polish-Lithuanian state, having been observed by Orthodox Catholics. They developed mainly in towns and cities, and at first consisted of the bourgeoisie alone, but later the nobility began to join them as well. They organized themselves around monasteries and were concerned with education, charity, and improving the liturgy. They worked for the good of the Orthodox Church, neglected and abandoned by the clergy. They also prepared the ground for the future union with Rome, but then, after the Union of Brest, they refused to submit to episcopal authority. The Constantinopolitan Patriarch used the Orthodox brotherhoods against the bishops by taking them out of their jurisdiction. This caused numerous conflicts. Patriarch Joachim even granted the Lviv confraternity, and, following his example, all other confraternities similarly operated, the right of curse or excommunication and the supervision of lower clergy and even bishops themselves. He also obliged them to report to the Patriarch of Constantinople about Orthodox priests and bishops. The cunning Byzantine divide and rule caused further confusion in the Orthodox Church and was an additional reason for the bishops to come under the jurisdiction of the Pope. In the 1690s, a widespread conviction prevailed among the Orthodox bishops, clergy, monks, magnates, nobles, and townspeople as to the need for union with Rome and the profound reform that this entailed. This was the result of a spiritual and intellectual effort that had lasted for several generations. It was possible under the conditions of peace and freedom created by the Polish-Lithuanian state on its territory. All this led the Orthodox bishops to opt for the union, which was approved by King Sigismund III Vasa in August 1595. After this, Bishop Cyril Teleki and Hippolyte Potier went to Rome and declared their willingness to recognize the supremacy of Rome. Pope Clement VIII proclaimed the union of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in December 1595. A separate uniate rite was established, retaining separate customs, liturgy, calendar, and the right to ordain married men as diocesan priests, but recognizing the primacy of the Pope and the truths of the faith of the Latin Church. At a synod of Orthodox bishops held in Brest in October-August 1596, the union of the Latin Church with the Orthodox Church was proclaimed. This created the Uniate Church, today known as the Greek Catholic Church. The Union of Brest was a momentous event, an epoch-making success and achievement. Here it was possible to achieve ecclesiastical unity of Christians in the Polish-Lithuanian state completely peacefully, without coercion. The preparations for the introduction of the Union met with counter-action from forces and circles that could lose something as a result of it, i.e., whose interests were threatened. Prince Ostrogsky, who, 2 years earlier, offended in his pride at not having a decisive say in the matter, and because of his Calvinist views on the Church, had already moved into the camp of the Union's enemies. Even before the Union was finalized at the Turin Congress in 1595, Ostrogsky formed a Protestant Orthodox alliance of a distinctly anti-Catholic and anti-Union character. Protestants, as a result of the successes of the Counter-Reformation, were also losing supporters en masse. Together, therefore, they demanded in Parliament that the Union be abolished. Ostrogsky managed to persuade 2 bishops from Lviv and Przemysl not to join the Union, and Orthodox propaganda slandered the Uniates. For example, Bishop Hippolyte Potier was accused of secretly embracing Judaism and of circumcising himself. Prince Ostrogsky's persuasion that the Union would abolish the Eastern Rite and replace it with the Roman one achieved its goal. Union was not introduced in many areas where Orthodox and Protestant nobles ruled. Not too surprisingly, the Eastern clergy reacted with hostility to the consolidation of episcopal power and the bishops' stamping out of numerous abuses. In their resistance, they found support from the prince and the Orthodox nobility convinced by him. On the other hand, the Orthodox Church fraternities, composed of lay people engaged in education and charity, had, in view of the previous decline of the clergy, gained a high position in the Orthodox Church, and now, in the new situation, were losing the importance and privileges of exemption from episcopal authority. What a paradox! With their activities, they were laying the groundwork for the Union, and when it came, they acted against it. This was instigated by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was terrified of losing his main source of income, the Kiev metropolis. The Orthodox, in alliance with the Protestants, acted to liquidate the union by legal and political means. These plans, in view of the growing predominance of the Catholic nobility in Parliament, were never carried out. The union itself did not find sufficient understanding among Catholics of the Latin Rite. The union was met with great indifference and even reluctance by the Catholic nobility and the Latin episcopate. The Catholic primate Gembicki even demanded the abolition of the union and the transfer of the uniates to the Latin Rite, claiming that the union was unnecessary and even dangerous for the state, that the diversity of rites was not in the interest of ecclesiastical unity, and that it would be far more certain and permanent to unite the Ruthenians with the Church if they adopted the Latin Rite. The implementation of the union faced a whole series of obstacles, and a very important arrangement of the union, the provision of seats in the Senate for uniate bishops, as was the situation with Latin bishops, could not be realized. This step would have clearly indicated ecclesiastical unity and equality between the two rites. Sometimes the uniates themselves treated their rite as something transitory and converted en masse to the Latin Rite. Why did the Union of Brest hurt the Orthodox Church so much? On the one hand, it was the property of the bishoprics, parishes and uniate monasteries, which the Orthodox regarded as their own. Taking away the temples and estates from the uniate church became the leitmotif of the Orthodox MPs' demands during the parliamentary sessions. Above that, they were losing believers to the union with each passing year. This process was reinforced by the coquetting of the Cossacks by the Orthodox clergy. The Cossacks' barbaric and robber methods of defending orthodoxy against alleged oppression by Catholics and uniates weakened the reputation of orthodoxy. But there was something more to their hostility towards the union. The Orthodox claimed to be the sole heir of Eastern Christianity, which they regarded as the only true one in the face of Rome's alleged heresies, the very Orthodox. Therefore, the very existence of the uniates, Christians cultivating Eastern liturgy, Eastern spirituality and traditions, and being in union with the Pope, undermined the very raison d'être of their existence and the further point of remaining in schism. The very existence of the union was regarded by the Orthodox, and is regarded by them to this day, as their supposed great injustice. The union was fervently fought against by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was totally dependent on the Sultan, the ruler of Turkey. It was the Sultan who decided on the filling of this post. In practice, it was given to the one who donated the larger sum of money, so the income from the Kiev metropolis was crucial to stay in office. In addition, through his intermediary, Turkey was able to influence the internal situation in the Polish-Lithuanian state, with which Turkey competed around the Black Sea. In letters to the leaders of the Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople demanded a treacherous uprising against his own country in the event of a war between Turkey and the Polish-Lithuanian state. The weak and illusory royal power in the Polish-Lithuanian state was unable to stop treason, lawlessness, and anarchy. It was not possible to abolish the union itself by legal methods in courts and parliament, and to stop the process of mass abandonment of orthodoxy by the faithful. The Orthodox clergy, in desperation, reached for the argument of force which the Cossacks were to provide. The Orthodox Church, in the absence of arguments, spiritual and moral strength, relied solely on the armed strength of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were semi-nomadic steppe robbers. They inhabited the de facto barren steppes north of the Black Sea. They were a gathering of fugitives and outcasts or even criminals. They were people who could not fit into existing social structures. Such individuals were distinguished by their courage, determination, and enterprise. There was a kind of freedom among them. There were no borders or laws. Whoever wanted to settle where they wanted and take possession of as much land as they wanted. The Cossacks did not constitute a separate nation. They were made up of representatives of different nationalities. In the mid-17th century, there were more than 20 of them. Apart from the Ruthenians, who were the most numerous due to their proximity to the steppes where they could easily escape, there were Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Tatars, and Moldovans. There were also Germans and Jews, and even Spaniards. The Cossacks were governed by their own laws and elected their own leaders. The Cossacks created their own system of military democracy, combined with a dictatorship of commanders elected for the duration of looting or war expeditions. The Cossacks were divided into wealthy elders and their clientele, the poor blacks, who had little influence over decisions and did not hold office. In practice, the Cossacks paid little attention to the religion and origin of newcomers. It was more important that they were proficient with weapons. New Cossacks had to arrive at the Sicha without women. This rule was observed with the utmost firmness. A considerable number of Cossacks, unwilling to submit to any law, considered themselves free, not subject to any authority. They raided and plundered on their own, led by some warlord. The majority of Cossacks came from Christian societies and, in order to give their lives some semblance of honesty, they boastfully referred to robbery raids on Muslim populations as a fight against Islam. 16th-century travelers mention that mosques could also be found in Cossack areas. Thus, no religiosity was at the root of their raids, and they were only strictly looting expeditions. In fact, the Cossacks were completely indifferent religiously. In order to win the Cossacks for themselves, the Orthodox began to cozy up to the Cossacks. In order to convert them into an army of Orthodox crusaders, numerous Orthodox clergy and monks who had relatives among the Cossack elders were used. The Orthodox clergy so deftly praised and coquetted the Cossacks, calling them defenders of the true faith, that the Cossacks adopted support for orthodoxy as one of the main points of their political program. Obtaining some moral religious justification for their actions suited the Cossacks very well. Why did the Cossacks, steppe robbers, need the postulate of defending orthodoxy as a political manifesto? The Cossacks were firmly opposed to any attempt by the state to subjugate them. However, they needed some kind of political program to justify their emancipation aspirations. In 1648, a Cossack uprising broke out under Bogdan Khmelnytsky. It erupted out of revenge for property taken from him. Revenge alone, however, was not enough of a program for a popular uprising. Already in 1649, Khmelnytsky stated, "At first I fought for my injury and harm. Now I will fight for our Orthodox faith." Following the outbreak of this uprising, the demand for the liquidation of the Union and the expulsion of the Jesuits was again raised high on the initiative of the Orthodox clergy. The origins of the Cossacks' defense of orthodoxy go back to the beginning of the Union of Brest in 1596. At that time, there was a Cossack rebellion led by Semen Nalewajka. His brother Damian sat in a higher office in the Orthodox hierarchy and was an opponent of the Union. Probably under the influence of his brother, Nalewajko began to plunder the estates of bishops who had joined the Union of Brest. Because of these robberies, he was considered a defender of orthodoxy. Initially, the Cossack uprisings were successfully suppressed with arms until 1648. These uprisings had no political aims. They were a reaction to oppression, real or imaginary, and were directed against the aristocracy, nobility, Jews and Catholics, especially the Uniates. It was only when the Cossacks realized that they could not defeat the Polish-Lithuanian state militarily that in 1654 they surrendered to the sovereignty of the Muscovite Tsar and invaded Lithuania with him. With all their might, they marched on Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. It was before this invasion that Andrzej Bobola fled Vilnius and found refuge in Pinsk. At the same time, the Swedish king, with his powerful army, attacked Poland from the west. As if that were not enough, the invaders were joined in 1657 by Prince George II Rákóczi of Transylvania. Khmelnytsky placed 10,000 of his Cossacks under his command. Rákóczi joined with the Swedish king. Together, on the 10th of May, 1657, they captured Brest. Some of the Cossacks devoted to him were looting the Polesia area at that time. It was one of these Cossack troops under the command of Popenka, who in May, in the year 1657, ravaged Polesie, murdering Catholics and Jews there, that came to Janów Poleski, located near Pinsk. The Orthodox population joined the Cossacks in persecuting the Catholics. A Jesuit, Andrzej Bobola, was then hiding in the nearby village of Martyrdom. The Orthodox pointed to him as a great pest who had caused numerous departures from Orthodoxy and incited the Cossacks against him. The Cossack commander then sent a detachment with orders to capture Bobola and deliver him to Janów. It is possible that the news of the crimes committed by the Cossacks in Janów had already reached Martyrdom, and, as a result, Andrzej Bobola got on the wagon on the 16th of May to seek shelter elsewhere, because the Cossacks caught up with him still in Martyrdom, riding in the wagon. The coachman fled into the forest. Andrew Bobola remained where he was, and commending himself to God, calmly accepted the fate that was to befall him. He was then 66 years old, an old man by the standards of the time, and unable to escape pursuit. Moreover, he was already ill. It was past noon when a gang of Cossacks surrounded the old Jesuit. At first they converted him to orthodoxy by persuasion and threat. If the famous missionary had been persuaded, this could have been proclaimed as a great triumph for orthodoxy. Many Catholics and Uniates could have fallen in faith. But Bobola firmly refused. Then the execution began, which ended in a butcher's shed in Janów. The hatred oozed by the Orthodox clergy into the souls of Cossacks and simple folk bore rich fruits of death. In 1623, the Uniate Holy Bishop Józef Kuncewicz died a martyr's death in Vitebsk, murdered by a mob of Orthodox Christians. There were many more victims of this kind. By the middle of the 17th century, at least 100 diocesan priests had suffered martyrdom at the hands of Cossacks, not counting monks because of their membership of the Union. The seed of hatred sown by the Orthodox clergy in the first half of the 17th century bore bloody fruit when the rebellion led by Khmelnytsky broke out. The magnitude of Cossack cruelty towards Catholics was striking. Cossacks, with the complicity of the Orthodox population, committed mass murders of Catholics, clergy, and laity. The Cossacks destroyed churches and did not shrink from profaning the Eucharist. From 1648 to 1655, the Cossacks destroyed 39 Dominican monasteries alone and murdered 95 monks residing there. But the greatest hatred the Cossacks had for the Jesuits and the Uniates. There was no mercy for them. There was an atmosphere of acquiescence to rape and violence against Catholics. This was the situation that created the conditions for Andrzej Bobola's martyrdom to take place, in which he could give such wonderful testimony of faith, fidelity, and love. Fruits of the martyrdom and the message of St Andrew Bobola. In addition to meriting the crown of the martyr in heaven, St Andrew Bobola, by his passion, merited for himself a treasury of merits, which he can now share with us. He also merited the ability to intercede powerfully and exceptionally effectively for us in heaven. His petitions are exceptionally pleasing to God. He willingly shares the fruits of his passion, which is why he is so effective in settling various matters in heaven. St Andrew Bobola was a victim of the hatred that was instilled into the souls of the 17th century Cossacks by the Orthodox clergy in defense of their position, income, and errors. In his martyrdom, one can see the same pattern that has constantly appeared in the history of the Church since the martyrdom of St. Stephen Unable to face the truth, the wisdom, the power of the Spirit, opponents reach for the argument of force and liquidation, those who cannot be defeated by reason and the force of arguments. St Andrew Bobola was not an accidental victim, as it seems to some. When he fell into the hands of his persecutors, his fate was not a foregone conclusion. He could have preserved his life at the cost of denying his faith. It was not he found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Providence had prepared him beforehand for what was to come. In Jesuit spirituality, which he practiced ardently, man's goal is to be conformed to Christ, and the summit of perfection is to be conformed to the rejected, humiliated, and tormented Jesus. The desires and prayers that Jesuit Janów Bobola must have been carrying throughout his monastic life were answered by heaven. During his ordeal, he was scourged, had his crown, and was pierced, and died around the 15th hour. The circumstances that occurred, and in which Andrew Bobola found himself, served Providence to reveal and highlight the truth of the one and true Church, which is, after all, the mystical body of the Son of God. My faith is true and leads to salvation. Even if Andrew Bobola had not uttered these words, in the face of torture and the threat of death, by his very refusal to convert to orthodoxy, he pointed to the true Church. He professed his faith with martyrdom and sealed it with his own blood. And if he had the strength to endure such cruel torture, did he not then have support from above? In his hour of trial, he received this help from heaven to persevere in the Church and to be faithful to what he lived and preached and convinced others to do. Throughout his religious and priestly life, he built up in himself this unshakable attitude of faith in the one, holy, universal, and apostolic Church. Perhaps the purpose of his life and of this whole situation was precisely this message, an indication of the true and only Church. His witness is directed not only to the outside of the Church, but also to the inside. His martyrdom tells why it is better to be a Catholic, because it is the true faith, and it gives salvation or eternal happiness after death. St Andrew Bobola is therefore the patron saint of true ecumenism, i.e. one that brings separated Christians back into the Catholic Church, one that, in addition to witnessing to charity, piety, and zeal, does not shy away from resolute polemic, demonstration of error, and instruction. The martyr is a model for the clergy and pastors of the Church to follow. His message to his separated brethren, "My faith is true and leads to salvation. It is you who convert and do penance, for you will not save yourselves in your errors," is an expression of the greatest love and is still relevant today. If you are interested in the figure of St Andrew Bobola, reach for the book God's Warrior, The Story of St Andrew Bobola. Visit also the website anjbobola.info.